It's great to welcome to the program today Mara Hvistendahl, who's the former China correspondent for Science and also author of The Scientist and the Spy, a true story of China, the FBI, and industrial espionage. So great to talk to you today, Mara.
Thanks again for having me on the show.
So let's start with industrial espionage. Many people not familiar with this or may have an idea of what it means. Donald Trump notably talking about it, typically in reference to China, China treating us unfairly, China stealing intellectual property. What's the big picture of industrial espionage? Is it typically involving intellectual property? What are the sort of different types that maybe exist?
Yeah, so going after industrial espionage from China has been a huge priority of the Trump administration. It is one of the ostensible justifications for the trade war that he started with China. But the focus on it actually goes back over a decade to the Obama administration. The FBI made fighting industrial espionage a top priority and started taking on investigations involving technologies like the whitener in Oreo cookies, wind turbines, and even genetically modified corn, which is at the heart of my book. And
So,
so,
on that note, I mean, so
yeah.
if we think of the whitener in Oreo cookies, for example, doesn't sound like there are major national security implications necessarily. But when it comes to industrial espionage, how frequently are classified technologies involved? How frequently are government contractors or programs and research involved?
There have been cases involving national security technologies, but the US government has basically been arguing that an attack on our US corporations and an attack on our economic security is an attack on national security. So there's been this kind of expansive reimagining of what national security means as this has become a priority.
When you talk about industrial espionage, is the motivation typically a motivation of getting an advantage when it comes to the ability to earn a profit? I mean, is that national security instances aside, is that mostly what is at issue here, trying to earn a profit by getting some kind of technology, technique, product, or otherwise an element of something from another company?
Sure. Yeah, China's developing very rapidly, or it was developing, I should say, before the start of the global pandemic.
Yeah.
And there are a lot of companies who are, really just interested in short term getting ahead at all costs. Stealing technology is the most expedient way to do that. But I wanted to draw attention to whether this is the best use of our resources. The policies that the Trump administration put in place led to the deterioration of US China relations, which is now absolutely critical. Now we're seeing with the pandemic that cooperation could be essential to fighting it. And all of this back and forth over industrial espionage really led to the decline of that relationship.
So, not that an eye for an eye is the right or the wrong thing, but just so that we have all the information, how frequently
Yeah.
is the US doing the same thing elsewhere?
The US stance is that we don't spy for the specific benefit of our private corporations. Now, there are some people who take issue with that, who point to small examples of it could have happened here or there. But in general, the U.S. is at a point in our development where we don't need to. There were certainly points in our history where we did take a lot of technologies. Even in early America, there was quite a lot that was stolen from England, for example. But China's now at that stage where it is rapidly developing and where the U.S. has a lot of desirable technologies. I mean, but the question is, should an ear of corn be treated like a national security secret?
Yeah, so let's get into that story. I mean, describe the story that you tell and highlight in the book, The Scientist and the Spy.
So I look at the case of Robert Moll, who was a Chinese-born engineer who was found in an Iowa cornfield in 2011. He was initially suspected of trespassing, but his appearance there ended up setting off this 2-year FBI investigation involving surveillance planes, airport busts, and the use of a FISA warrant, which is intended to be reserved for extreme national security threats.
And what was he trying to accomplish in that cornfield?
Well, it was a Monsanto cornfield. The company treated the next generation hybrid corn that was growing there as trade secrets. Robert Moe worked for a Beijing agricultural company that wanted to steal that corn. At one point, they actually tried to send it back to China in microwave popcorn bags. So they had this kind of harebrained scheme. And the FBI, meanwhile, decided to track them over years, bugging their cars, chasing them across the Midwest. And so you had this kind of absurd cat and mouse chase that in the end was a massive use of taxpayer resources.
Yeah, so there's so much to talk about with regard to this. I mean, what you mentioned the question of, is this a good use of FBI resources which are taxpayer funded? That's one debate to be had. The other question is this another example of corporate power and the degree to which corporations dictate law enforcement priorities? Whether you want to talk about private prisons existing influences the judicial system and how the judicial system functions. Should that be the case? I would argue no. Is that not another underlying story here, which is that because of who Monsanto is, they have a lot of say in what the FBI does and doesn't work on?
Oh, definitely. So I retraced Robert Moe's steps. I retraced the steps of the FBI agent who was tailing him. At one point there were 70 some agents working on the case, so dozens of people in multiple states. Just a massive use of resources. And as I was traveling around the Midwest talking to farmers about this case, there were many people who said to me, look, Monsanto and DuPont Pioneer, another company in this case, they have massively consolidated over the past few years. To the point where the price of seed has gone up for many farmers. And when you look at what the impediments to innovation in agriculture are, that corporate consolidation is a very big one.
Now, on the other side of this, it's very easy to say, hey, listen, there's intellectual property here and the intellectual property is being violated or threatened. You've got a guy standing in a cornfield. It's sort of pretty cut and dry, aside from whether the FBI should be involved or only local police or whatever. That's one question. But on the other side of that, is it maybe too easy to get intellectual property protection for things that one could debate whether they should or should not be subject to that level of protection from government intellectual property infrastructure, in the sense that, when we talk about what can you trademark, what can you patent, et cetera, that's another side to this story.
That is, I do think there is a big place for IP protection.
Of course.
I'm a writer. I believe that my work should be protected.
Sure.
I don't want people out there pirating my book.
Same with my content.
Other hand,
absolutely agree.
On the other hand, when you look at what should be done to protect innovation in this country, there's also a big role for antitrust enforcement. Right. And that's something that has really taken a backseat to other priorities in the past few years. But even in the Obama years, there were several big antitrust actions that fell apart. And one of them involved Monsanto. So even as the Justice Department was bringing this case basically on behalf of Monsanto, there was an antitrust inquiry explored by another arm of the department that then fell apart.
Well, that seems to be, if you zoom out, that's the trend, right? Which is when it comes to allowing intellectual property protection, it by and large benefits large corporations over small individuals. And we see that, in my space, we see it on platforms like YouTube and others, where the benefit of the doubt by default goes to the large media company and not the small producer, et cetera. You bring up antitrust, which is an opportunity to regulate and control some of these large corporations. But again, there it's not nearly enough used, as you're sort of pointing out. So is that the overarching story, or what is really the overarching story here when it comes to industrial espionage in your mind?
Well, ultimately, I was drawn to this story because it was such a good story. It had all these twists and turns and these interesting characters. Nobody was really fully all good or all bad,
Mm.
and just very kind of complex. And I saw that I could structure it like a thriller. But at the same time, it also tapped into all these other themes of corporate control, of the expansion of what constitutes national security, of the FBI turning itself from a law enforcement agency into a counterintelligence agency, which has also played a big role in the expansion of what constitutes an investigation. And so this, by looking at this one small case, I could get at all of these other issues.
So if we zoom out from this case a little bit, can you give us some other types of industrial espionage that maybe are less obvious than the case we're talking about, corn and Monsanto seeds and some of those others that are under that umbrella? What else is included under this umbrella of industrial espionage more broadly?
Oh, pharmaceuticals, the insulation that's used in walls, a lot of industrial compounds and chemicals. And, if you look at the major corporations in America and what they're manufacturing, many of those products have been the subject of these industrial espionage actions.
This stuff can be life and death in some cases, right? I mean, now when we're talking about N95 masks and masks that are at issue when it comes to healthcare workers that are treating coronavirus patients, and you start hearing about rotten masks or faulty masks, masks that are called N95 but aren't really. I mean, this is all wrapped up with some of this intellectual property, is it not?
Right. Well, yeah, counterfeiting is a big issue as well. And I've just been looking into that for another story. Certainly a big concern. And that is really about the concern over PPE and masks and where they're coming from. That's really about global supply chain issues. And that's certainly been complicated by the trade war that Trump has started with China. And, also just by the general decline in U.S.-China relations. So over the past few weeks, things have really reached a new low with China, and precisely at the moment when we most need to be cooperating on this issue.
So last thing I want to touch on is as far as the trade war and the inclusion of, again, trying to stop Chinese spying and theft of intellectual property. Donald Trump very loudly said that China is doing this. He said the trade not trade agreement, but the tariffs and the larger package that he put in place was going to solve that. And he even recently offhandedly said that this is something that he has now fixed through his policy. What's the truth of that?
Yeah.
Is the policy that Trump put in place, including tariffs, actually solving this issue?
It certainly hasn't. It certainly hasn't helped us in terms of sourcing medical supplies from China because there are still some tariffs in place. But just more generally, he has pushed us away from China. Things were already bad when he came into office, but by using phrases like Chinese virus and kind of perpetually pointing fingers, encouraging China to do the same, which they have. We've reached a really a new low point in U.S.-China relations.
What would be a policy that would actually work constructively to resolve the issue of industrial espionage between the U.S. and China?
Well, whatever we do, we need to put in place a policy that doesn't make researchers feel targeted. So that's another piece of the puzzle, is that there is this perception among many Chinese American and Chinese scientists that they are being singled out because of their ethnicity. And some of them maybe have committed infractions, but there are also cases where people have been arrested who turned out to be innocent.
Mm.
And so that's ultimately detrimental to the U.S. innovation infrastructure if we drive out a lot of the research force. And we're seeing that now as we try to develop vaccines and try to develop treatments for COVID-19, that many of the people who could be working on this are now back in China because they've been driven out by overzealous investigations.
We've been speaking with Mara Hvistendahl, who is the former China correspondent for Science and also author of the book The Scientist and the Spy, a true story of China, the FBI, and industrial espionage. Mara, so great having you on. I really appreciate your time.
Well, thank you again.